2 years ago, Ukraine had no displaced people. Today, it finds itself on the top 10 list of nations with the largest populations of displaced people in the world. Also 2 years ago, the World Food Program had no food assistance program in Ukraine, but now it does, and since mid-November, WFP has reached 250,000 people with food parcels, vouchers, or cash. So Ukraine does find itself now in a club of countries that includes countries like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And you know, with upwards of 2 million people internally displaced, many of them the elderly, women, and children, it's easy for people on the move to disappear into obscurity. That is why, again, it's vitally important that forums such as this shine light on this important topic. As I usually do, I wanted just to update you on the current security situation in Ukraine. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine reports daily, and I'll just give you a snapshot of what the situation is in the East right now, because of course it does impact upon the humanitarian situation. So most recently, and unfortunately, ceasefire violations continued despite an agreement reached on December 22nd, whereby all sides decided to comply with the existing ceasefire agreement during the holiday period. Whereas in areas at around Donetsk airport, the Special Monitoring Mission noted no ceasefire violations for several consecutive days. Horlivka and southern Donetsk region saw actually an increase in violence. And in areas not controlled by the government, the monitoring mission experienced increased freedom of movement restrictions and some hostility towards the monitors. And I could use a stronger word than hostility. It was really a tough time for colleagues of mine for quite some time when they were held by rebel groups in Donetsk and at gunpoint. Also, what we're seeing in the conflict zone, there have been heavy exchanges involving, once again, multiple launch rocket systems, artilleries, and mortars. Although the Luhansk region has remained relatively calm, there are a large number of tanks in areas southwest of Luhansk, allegedly there for training, that can create uncertainty and fear, of course, and lead to unforeseen consequences. Also, recent violence in around Horlivka highlighted one important fact, and that is weapons which should have been withdrawn have not gone. The area of concern right now is this kind of triangle of southern Donetsk region, including Polio, Oktябry, the Kominternove triangle. And since the armed forces of Ukraine deployed to Polio in November, the so-called DPR, DNR, contracted with deployment of men and hardware to nearby Kominternove. The forces move closer to each other, and that's of course exactly the opposite of what is needed right now, because whenever you have a concentration of heavy weaponry and men, the chances of escalation is very, very high. And of course, an example of what can happen in this type of situation is the very, very sad situation, the abandoned and destroyed village of Shirokine, which is just east of Mariupol, where over the course of several months last year, relentless shelling has driven all of its residents away. And by the way, those very, very few who have stayed have basically been living in basements for months on end, and where you have where most of the houses are either destroyed, totally destroyed or damaged, and it's left the city entirely uninhabitable due to mines and unexploded ordnance. And in the conflict zone, heavy weapons do continue to be moved around or concealed. On both sides, weapons that have been declared were found to be either absent from their permanent weapon storage sites, or the serial numbers of observed weapons did not match those on inventory. Now, of course, the course of the conflict continued to affect the daily lives of civilians along the contact line. The shortage of medical supplies in hospitals remains very worrying. In particular, the delivery of hemodialysis equipment for the 46 patients at the hospital in Horlivka is a particular concern right now. And I guess we can view this as a positive step. On the 28th of December, the NGO called Association Internationale de Coopération Médicale, or AICM, informed the Special Monitoring Mission that they were last registered by the so-called DPR in order to proceed with the donation of urgently life-saving medicines and equipment for patients. But shortages of medicines and equipment and staff is very, very common in hospitals and clinics all throughout the conflict zone, and children are particularly vulnerable. Many hospitals are now, for example, reporting lack of oxygen supplies. Now, I sincerely wish I could be standing here before you today with better news for the immediate future, but it does occur that there's currently no end in sight. The IDP problem is one which Ukraine, and by extension the international community, will have to grapple with for a very, very long time indeed. And a few months ago, peace in the east of Ukraine appeared tantalizingly close. Agreements in Minsk brought about high expectations that a lasting ceasefire would take hold, that heavy weaponry would be moved away from the contact line and stored safely, and that armed individuals would go back to wherever they came from. And sadly, the guns have not fallen silent, and although some weaponry has been decommissioned and stored, as I said, in the last few days, heavy weaponry has been in use in the east. Meanwhile, what I've called on networks like CNN, creeping institutionalization is taking place in rebel-held territories. And what I mean by that is, for example, introduction of new business registration practices, the introduction of the ruble, the introduction of a new time zone that coincides with Moscow, new curriculum in schools, and Russian products replacing Ukrainian products. And also, this is not something that's been happening for quite some time, is new, very propagandistic media institutions, TV stations, radio, newspapers, and magazines have been started in rebel-held territories. And I can tell you from my own visits to rebel-held Donetsk, it really shocked us how well funded some of these rebel-controlled media institutions is. And it leads to the question, where is the funding coming from? By the way, all the international news organizations at CNN and BBC that have devoted amongst the most coverage to the conflict and have stuck with the story. And in fact, I've just learned that BBC is now actually going to have a permanent correspondent in Ukraine, so that's very good news for the issue. So I know you've heard a lot already about the plight of IDPs throughout Ukraine, but you know, I've had an opportunity, along with my colleagues, to meet and listen to many of them and on both sides of the conflict. And you know, I can say that if there's one common message that unites them all, is that we want peace, and that we want to return to our homes. We want to rebuild our lives. But what they also say is that they will not return home until they can be assured of peace. And you can tell by my recent security update that that isn't happening anytime soon. And in the meantime, many do fear that their homes and property will be destroyed. As the video we just saw showed, many homes have actually been looted, and IDPs from towns like Piski find it very difficult to visit their homes from actually both sides of the contact line. And one phenomenon we see very, very often is that when military positions are located in residential areas, and when these positions are used, they spark return fire, and often with disastrous consequences. Now, speaking of internally displaced people, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission was one of the first to report on the plight of the IDPs and on the strain that such a large caseload could place on communities, families, NGOs, and government coffers. Many months ago, in fact, some cities such as Dnipropetrovsk and Mariupol declared that should the flow of migrants continue at the pace it was, that they may have to declare that they're at full capacity, they can't take any more because the strain is so heavy. And you know, even before the migrant crisis started, many NGOs that would have been expected to shelter the IDPs were already in dire straits in Ukraine. There were widespread reports that the government of Ukraine was slow to meet their needs. I think you heard some of that today already, especially tracking them and also providing them with their allowances. Red tape was everywhere, and it made it difficult for IDPs to obtain meager allowances. And as you've heard, Kyiv has come in for criticism for a lack of a centralized registration system and for limited funding allocations to the IDPs. Now, and I may get into a bit of trouble saying this, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway, is one area where the government could have acted in a much better way, but hasn't in any appreciable way, is to alleviate human suffering by allowing freer access across the contact line. A very, very restricted permit system introduced almost a year ago, the Ukrainian government said it was for security reasons, has meant that many civilians spend hours upon hours waiting to cross back and forth over the contact line to do things like receive their pensions, do banking, purchase groceries, medicines, and visit relatives. We have seen with our own eyes queues of hundreds and hundreds of cars waiting to enter so-called DPR-controlled Donetsk. And this has happened in the heat of summer. It was a very, very hot summer this past summer in Ukraine, and also in the paralyzing cold of winter, with little or no shelter at the crossing lines. And in the process, civilians have suffered immensely. And they're also unnecessarily exposed to shelling. And unexploded mine contamination is another challenge, as existing warning signs are not in accordance with international mine action standards. And the signs that are, some of the signs that are located in fields are not visible from the road or are too far apart. And also last June, a government order restricting public commercial transport vehicles across the contact line means that many IDPs have to cross on foot. Now, to give you an example or an idea of the human flow taking place, in the month of December alone, almost 750,000 people crossed the contact line through only 5 operational official checkpoints. And the majority of people crossing the contact line in the government-controlled areas are elderly, many with restricted mobility, single women, families with children, and a few single men. And then you have the residents of the so-called gray areas, including those living in no man's land or close to the contact line in government-controlled areas. They are subject to the exact same restrictions. So humanitarian partners continue to advocate for simplification of procedures for people to cross the contact line, in an attempt, of course, to minimize the undue hardship on the civilian population. And by the way, in recent weeks, too, journalists, foreign correspondents have reported to me and posted on Facebook, for instance, that they're facing increasing difficulty crossing into rebel-held territories in Luhansk and Donetsk. And even if they do manage to get in there, they're carefully monitored, and their access is very, very limited. In fact, we have found out that there are actually bureaucrats within the so-called DNR in Donetsk City that go through the Facebook accounts and Twitter postings of foreign journalists to see if they've been critical. And if they've been too critical, no more access to rebel-held zones. Now, on the economic front, it's a very, very bleak picture, as you've got an idea, I think, from previous speakers. Many ordinary civilians are hardly coping. They're dealing with rising inflation, the lack of jobs and social assistance, and the savings of many have been entirely depleted. And let me give you an example here. According to the World Food Programme's latest food security assessment for Ukraine, 30% of households in non-government controlled areas do not have sufficient funds for basic needs. More than half barely have enough money to buy food, and only 20% have enough money to eat, but they have depleted savings. And over the past 3 months, 60% of households saw their income decrease, and 6% reported no income whatsoever. Now, in government-controlled areas close to the contact zone, the situation is equally bleak. 54% of households do not have sufficient funds for basic needs. 40% have barely enough money to buy food, and only 7% have enough to eat but have depleted their savings. At the same time, more than 60% of households experience significant income decreases over the past 3 months. It's a very interesting statistic here. For example, the average salary offered for vacancies on the so-called DPR labor vacancy website is about 4,400 rubles. I think that's the equivalent of about 1,600 hryvni. And of course, that's well below the national Ukrainian average of 4,500 hryvni a month. And to make matters worse, I know a lot of Torontonians will appreciate this, but food prices remain almost 25% more in non-government controlled areas than in government controlled areas. And overall, Ukrainian share of expenditure on food remains among the highest in the world, with around 52% in government controlled areas, 52% in government controlled areas, and 80% in non-government controlled areas spending that share of their income on food alone. I can't stand here without making a little mention of what's happening right now throughout Ukraine. And as many of you might have heard, Ukraine is in the midst right now of a polio outbreak. Of course, this sort of thing has to be dealt with very swiftly. And a third round of immunizations, and by the way, many of the vaccines funded by Canada, is about to start. It's unbelievable for a modern nation like Ukraine, but currently Ukraine has vaccination rates of only about 50%, but they should be close to 90 or 95% actually. And a big reason for this is a lack of public trust in immunization. But the government also has a long kind of list of things to do, and that includes improving, for example, its outbreak surveillance and response. A few months ago, for instance, it's hard to believe, but there was a complete stockout of childhood vaccines in Ukraine. And Ukraine is one of the few countries in the developed world that doesn't have a separate line item in its budget for vaccine purchases. It's gotten to such a degree that the World Health Organization, at the end of last year, called on the president of Ukraine to declare a public health emergency in response to the polio outbreak. And I can tell you, as we've seen in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where you have very mobile populations, it's very, very difficult to achieve those high rates of vaccination with people on the move. So you actually have to exert extra effort. And I just discovered a couple of hours ago that there's now a flu epidemic in the Donetsk region, the government-controlled side, and that's resulted in the closure of many schools. One thing for sure, when the fighting ends, and of course we all hope that will be soon, there will be a huge, huge repair bill. And again, remember I mentioned that a lot of the IDPs told us that in order to go back, we need the fighting to stop. But they also fear that their homes will no longer be there, and many, many have been destroyed. There are things like airports, bridges, roads, buildings, schools, and hospitals which have sustained massive damage. I think a few months ago the UN did a survey. This was actually many months ago, and the repair bill then stood at a little over 1 billion. I would speculate that it's probably several times that by now. So in the meantime, while this conflict is going on, one of the things I have been advocating is that Ukraine focus on developing its core strengths in areas, for example, in agriculture. It was a bumper harvest, by the way, last year for Ukraine, yet there's a lot of wastage in the transport, for example, of grain. And there's also really promising bright lights happening, for example, in the city of Lviv, in the high tech, and also in tourism, and also in fashion. And believe it or not, this suit was made in Ukraine and wear it a lot by a fashion designer from Donetsk who fled and is now in Kiev. And then, of course, with such a large displaced population, and as you've heard, many of them are living in temporary shelters or reception centers or with friends and family, is that more permanent resettlement arrangements will need to be looked at. And of course, new job opportunities need to be created. Now, it's interesting, you know, Ukraine is an amazing country. Love it to death, and you know, we've been all amazed time and time again at the hospitality of people across Ukraine, as far away as Lviv, where they've taken in migrants from the eastern part of Ukraine. But there is, I think, from what I observed and from anecdotal evidence, a certain amount of friction with such a high influx of migrants to such popular centers as Kiev. It spurred inflation, especially with rents. Small business owners also have complained that entrepreneurs from Donetsk have come up and set up, for example, small businesses right next to theirs. So, oh, and by the way, I take the taxi a lot in Kiev, and I notice a lot more Donetsk accents among some of the taxi drivers as well. So that's another business they're quite eager to get into. So kind of to wrap up is, what are some of the ways the West can help? Well, I just had a word with our ambassador as well, and now is not the time for countries like Canada to restrict the issuance of visas to honest, hard-working Ukrainians. I understand the refusal rate is about 30% right now. It's very high. And when former Prime Minister Harper was in Kiev last year, the question was put to him, what is going on with Ukrainians being turned down for visas so much? And his reply was, well, there's got to be a good reason that they're being turned down. But I think, seriously, the new government needs to take a look at this. And fortunately, we have a fantastic Canadian ambassador in Ukraine who's very committed and dedicated and hardworking. And now, I think, and I feel very passionately about this, now is also the time to increase the opportunities for young Ukrainians to take advantage of overseas internships and scholarships. Now's the time for them to sniff that air of freedom, to taste Western values where the rule of law prevails. And I've been to Ukraine many times, and I usually have the opportunity to hire young Ukrainians. And the big difference this time was that you now have this core group of young Ukrainians who have worked in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. They come back to Ukraine with that experience, with those skills, and help rebuild the country. But I can tell you, in my team, very dedicated team that works with me, they have incredible skills in terms of social media, in terms of media handling, those sorts of things. That is why those human ties are so important and those opportunities to increase. And also, as I alluded to, there needs to be increased advocacy to guarantee the free and unimpeded access for all humanitarian organizations and to minimize bureaucratic impediments. Also, of course, advocacy for the Ukrainian government to improve the flow of civilians back and forth over the contact line. And also, of course, there's the question of money. The United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine remains at about 50% unfunded. The shortfall is almost $150 million. Now, Canada has donated generally. In fact, when it comes to Ukraine, Canada often pushes above its weight. It's number 4 in terms of funding the UN response plan, behind the EU, USA, and Germany. And I can tell you also that in the special monitoring mission, Canada has provided, I think the current number is around 20 or 25 monitors to the mission. And when you compare this to the United States, 50 for a country much, much smaller, this is a very high proportion. And then finally, a huge need is going to be in the area of demining, especially in heavily contaminated cities like Rouble. Ukraine will need funding, equipment, and people to undertake this. And there's also going to be a need for specialized technology. You've all seen the heavily shelled Donetsk airport. We walked through it just a few weeks ago. And I've been to some pretty inhospitable places on Earth, and I can't remember ever seeing anything like that. We were in that terminal building when it was brand new. We were also there in the spring of 2014 when we saw, it was incredible to see, but the Donetsk People's Republic flag hoisted over that terminal building, and I thought to myself, this cannot be a good harbinger of things to come. But now there's been so much shelling because it really is a kind of ground zero for the fighting going on, that it's going to take very, very specialized equipment to move all of those unexploded mines and bombs away in order to establish a new facility there, if in fact that even happens. Thank you very much.